The Xerix Dominion had conquered countless worlds. Their fleets blackened the skies 100 species. Their warriors unchallenged, their rule absolute. When they turned their gaze to Earth, they saw nothing but another primitive world, ripe for subjugation. Their analysts reviewed human history and found it filled with war, but not the kind that worried them. Humans fought each other more than they fought outsiders. Divided, chaotic, emotionally driven, the Xerix saw no true threat. Their warlord, Supreme Commander Zalvor, stood before his fleet, his voice cold and assured. Earth will fall within days. Their weapons are outdated, their strategy predictable. They will beg before the end. His officers nodded, already envisioning another easy victory. The invasion commenced without hesitation. Massive warships descended through Earth's atmosphere, blotting out the sun over major cities. Energy bombardments reduced government buildings to rubble within minutes. The Xerix landed with precision, deploying shock troopers to secure key locations. Panic spread across human streets. Just as predicted, civilians fled, overwhelmed by the sight of towering alien machines and the deafening roar of war. Zalvor observed from orbit, watching as his troops marched through the burning ruins of human civilization. Resistance appeared disorganized. Isolated military forces fought back, but were swiftly crushed. Communications between human factions fractured. Governments fell silent, overwhelmed by the sheer speed of the attack. Everything proceeded as planned. Then something changed. Reports arrived of Xerix patrols disappearing without a trace. A unit stationed in New York failed to check in. A supply convoy in Tokyo was found incinerated, its escorting soldiers stripped of their armor. Zalvor dismissed these as minor disruptions, nothing more than the last gasps of a dying species. But the disruptions continued. Xerix outposts went dark one by one. Surveillance drones captured glimpses of humans moving in the shadows, striking with precision and vanishing without a trace. Entire battalions stopped responding, their final transmissions filled with panic screams. The Xerix had fought rebels before, but this was different. Rebels resisted the win. Humans fought to annihilate. Captured Xerix soldiers were returned, but they were unrecognizable. Some were found missing limbs, others with warnings carved into their exoskeletons. One message was consistent across every returned body: you only go to war with humans once. Panic began to spread through the invasion force. Xerix warriors who once marched with confidence now hesitated before stepping into the ruins of human cities. The enemy was no longer a scattered resistance. It was something else, something relentless. Zalvor ordered an immediate counteroffensive, deploying elite shock battalions to crush the human defiance. They never returned. Human tactics defied logic. They did not engage in open battle. They did not fight for territory. They fought for destruction. Infrastructure the Xerix relied on, communication networks, supply chains, defensive barricades, were wiped out overnight. The warships in orbit, once symbols of their absolute dominance, found themselves blind and vulnerable. Xerix forces adapted. Patrols doubled. Search parties scoured the ruins. But for every step they took forward, humanity took 3 steps ahead. The first desertions within the Xerix army began. Troopers refused to leave the safety of their bases, unwilling to step into the growing darkness that swallowed their comrades. Paranoia spread like wildfire. Soldiers shot at shadows, wasted ammunition on phantoms that struck without warning and vanished before retaliation could be made. Zalvor saw the shift happening, but refused to acknowledge its significance. Primitive creatures, he spat. They fight like rats in the dark because they fear us. But he was wrong. Humanity did not fight from the shadows out of fear. They fought from the shadows because it was the most efficient way to exterminate their enemy. And the Xerix were just beginning to understand. Zalvor sat in silence, staring at the reports flashing before him. The Xerix Dominion had never encountered a war like this. No battle lines, no negotiations, no rules. The humans were not fighting for survival. They were fighting for complete and utter annihilation of their enemy. His generals assured him that victory was inevitable. Humanity was still technologically inferior. Their fleets could not challenge the Xerix in space. Their weapons were outdated. Their resistance was a desperate struggle, nothing more. But the numbers told a different story. Xerx's casualties were rising at an unprecedented rate. Entire battalions ceased responding. Outposts were wiped out without a single distress call. The soldiers that were found had been stripped of their weapons, their armor, and in some cases, their dignity. Their bodies left in strategic locations as a message. Humans do not forgive. Humans do not forget. Panic spread among the Dominion's forces. The troops, once disciplined, now moved in disorganized clusters, terrified of stepping too far from the safety of their groups. Even the most battle-hardened warriors began questioning the invasion. They had fought countless wars, but never like this. Then came the psychological warfare. It started subtly. Xerx's commanders received conflicting orders for what they assumed were their superiors. Patrols were sent in circles, leading them directly into human ambushes. Supply routes were mysteriously redirected, leaving entire squads stranded without reinforcements. The humans had cracked the Xerx communication network. They weren't just intercepting transmissions, they were rewriting the war itself. Then the messages began. Xerx's troops awoke to find human words burned into the walls of their encampments. You only go to war with humans once. The phrase was everywhere, carved into fallen soldiers, scrawled in blood on their own equipment, broadcasted over hijacked communication channels. No one ever saw the humans who did it. No one ever caught them in the act. Sleep became a luxury. The fear of closing their eyes, only to awaken to another massacre, consumed them. Desperation led to brutality. Xerx's commanders ordered entire human cities to be wiped out indiscriminately in response. Civilians were rounded up and executed as a warning. But the warnings meant nothing. The human response was colder, crueler, and more efficient than before. The Xerx expected rage. They expected retaliation driven by grief. Instead, they got silence. There were no more distress signals. No desperate cries for mercy. The humans stopped broadcasting entirely. And then, the disappearances began. Entire Xerx platoons went missing overnight. The only evidence of their fate was their armor left behind, stacked neatly in piles. No bodies, no weapons, just empty suits of armor displayed like trophies. The horror only grew. Some Xerx soldiers began refusing to leave their ships, convinced that stepping onto human soil was a death sentence. Others reported hearing human whispers in their own language, despite knowing no humans were nearby. Some simply vanished mid-mission, their last transmissions filled with static and terrified breathing. Zalvor clenched his fists. This was not how wars were fought. The Xerx were conquerors. They subjugated species. They didn't fear them, but fear had taken root in his army. His own officers avoided eye contact when reporting to him. The once proud warriors of the Dominion flinched at shadows. Even in the safety of their warships, they jumped at flickering lights and hesitated before opening doors. The humans were inside their heads. The Xerx had superior weapons. They had superior numbers. They had superior ships. And none of it mattered. The moment the invasion began, they had already lost. Zalvor's command chamber was silent, except for the flickering of holographic screens. Reports of failure filled every display, painting a picture of a campaign that had spiraled out of control. Entire divisions gone. Supply chains obliterated. His elite forces, the ones he had once called unstoppable, had been hunted down like animals. He refused to believe it. This was Earth, a primitive world, a fractured species. It was impossible. But the numbers did not lie. The Xerx were not just losing, they were collapsing. His generals hesitated before speaking, their rigid discipline barely concealing the sheer terror in their eyes. Some suggested tactical withdrawal, an idea that would have been considered treason before this war began. Others argued for deploying more troops, but it was an empty suggestion. Reinforcements weren't coming. The supply lines had been cut. The ships still in orbit had ceased responding, their crews either missing or too terrified to land. The Xerx had fought countless species. They had faced empires that spanned the stars, civilizations that wielded weapons capable of sundering planets. And yet, none had done what humanity had done, because no other species fought like this. No other species made their enemies doubt their own reality. The last push began out of desperation. The Xerix launched one final, full-scale assault, throwing everything they had left to humanity in a last, desperate bid for victory. The largest deployment of troops since the beginning of the war. They marched into the ruins of human cities, expecting a last stand. They found nothing. No resistance. No enemy fire. Only silence. Then the ambushes began. Xerix forces were cut off from behind, their escape routes severed. Supply caches they thought were safe were already rigged with explosives. Heavy artillery, stolen from their own armories, turned against them, cutting down thousands in seconds. The humans had let them march in just to trap them inside. Xerix troops screamed for extraction, but their own commanders refused to send aid. The ones still in orbit watched the battle unfold in real time, knowing full well that there was nothing they could do. And then, for the first time in Xerix history, an entire army surrendered, not out of honor, not out of strategy, but out of pure, unrelenting terror. Tens of thousands of Xerix warriors, the same warriors who had once crushed entire worlds without hesitation, dropped their weapons and fell to their knees. They begged, and the humans simply stared. No response, no emotion, just that same quiet, merciless gaze. Zalvor watched the footage from orbit, his claws digging into the metal of his throne. He had always believed surrender was never an option, that the Dominion never bowed. But the war had never been in his control. The Xerix hadn't just lost. They had been taught a lesson. And now, humanity was about to deliver the final one. Zalvor's claws trembled as he gripped the edges of his throne. The chamber around him was silent. His officers frozen in place, their eyes locked on the holoscreens displaying the unthinkable. The Xerix Dominion had fallen on Earth, not in battle, not in some grand last stand, but in fear. He had watched as his warriors, the so-called unstoppable legions, had thrown down their weapons. He had seen them kneel before their human captors, not out of respect, not out of necessity, but because their minds had broken. The war had shattered something fundamental within them. The belief that the Xerix were superior. The certainty that they were the galaxy's apex predators. Humanity had erased that delusion. For the first time in his life, Zalvor was afraid. A transmission came through, not static, not distorted screams, not the usual guttural defiance of a lesser species. Just a voice, calm, controlled, cold. You only go to war with humans once. That same message. Again. But this time it wasn't a warning. It was a verdict. Zalvor's mandibles clenched. He refused to accept this. The Xerix had conquered countless civilizations. They had burned empires to ash. No species had ever dared to defy them like this. And yet humanity did not just defy them. They broke them. He had to salvage something. He had to maintain control. The Dominion was watching. Other species were watching. If word spread that the mighty Xerix had been humbled, then their entire empire would begin to fracture. He opened a channel to the humans. His image appeared before them, tall, armored, still every bit the warlord he had always been. "This war is over," he said, his voice heavy with authority. "Name your conditions." The Dominion does not wish for further conflict. A long silence followed. Then laughter. Not the laughter of joy. Not the laughter of relief. It was cold, hollow, and then the human responded. "You still think you're negotiating." Zalvor's blood chilled. Humans did not want terms. They did not want peace talks. They did not even want surrender. They wanted an example. The holoscreens flickered. More footage. Xerix warships disabled and drifting. Their crews nowhere to be found. Entire Dominion colonies dark, communications severed. Not attacked, not bombarded, erased. The Xerix Dominion had waged war for centuries. But this was what happened when you made an enemy of humanity. Zalvor understood now. The humans had never been fighting for survival. They had been fighting to send a message to the galaxy, one that would be burned into history forever. You only go to war with humans once. The transmission cut out. Zalvor exhaled slowly, the weight of realization settling on him like a mountain. He turned to his remaining officers, what was left of his once great war council. There was nothing left to say. The fleet withdrew from Earth in absolute silence. No final battle. No parting words. Just fear. And from that day forward, the Xerix Dominion, once the most feared force in the galaxy, never waged war again.